Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to our next session of reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 13, the last chapter of book one of the Politics, chapter 113, which he kind of wraps up the discussion of the household. Um, so let's go looking at it, right? It starts out with uh, chapter 12 dealt with kind of return to the theme of the parts of the household. And there he dealt with the, the fundamental part of husband, wife, parent, child, right? The two remaining parts where he having, before the first idea was master slave. Then he went into the discussion about slavery and the connection of mastery and slavery and the connection of them and what is they are doing. Then he dealt with the thematic question of, well, slavery is really about making more slaves, or big question of acquisition. And then he had a whole discussion of 3 or 4 chapters on acquisition, distinguish between natural forms of acquisition and unnatural forms of acquisition. And then and at the end of that discussion of acquisition, he returns to the household again, and he deals with the two relationships he didn't deal with. That was 12. Now 13, he continues this, right? It is evident then that household management gives more serious attention to human beings than to inanimate property, to the virtue or arete or excellence of these rather than to that of property, which we call wealth, and to the virtue or excellence of free persons rather than that of slaves. So therefore, the focus, he's saying here, the real focus of economics, it's not about material property, it's about rather human beings and their virtue, their excellence, the excellence of human beings, the arete or well-being, the excellence of human beings, and then tying it in more attention to then property, which is wealth. What we understand property as one of the bases of wealth. He's not saying it's not important, but the core focus is about dealing with human beings, and particularly he says, and regarding the virtue, and then therefore more focusing on free people, free persons rather than slaves, right? First, then, one might raise a question concerning slaves, whether there's a certain virtue belonging to a slave besides the virtue of an instrument and a servant, and more honorable than these, such as moderation and courage and justice, and the other dispositions of this sort, or whether there is none besides the bodily service. So there's the question is there in other is there a virtue in, okay, not is slavery virtuous? That's not the question, but rather in the condition of as a slave, is there an excellence of a slave? In other words, virtue in terms as arete, excellence, a well-doing, right? And he says virtue that is separate besides the question of the virtues of an instrument. In other words, the technical aspect. No, as an instrument, doing the instrument well. Is there about being a slave? Is there a way? There's something about the being a slave that has a virtue or excellence in it, aside from the instrumental aspect of it, right? And more honorable than these. In other words, in this and that virtue of being a slave in terms of its the higher this higher question of it's not its instrumentality, but rather than that, it's something. And again, such as moderation and courage and justice and the other dispositions of the sort, or whether there is a none besides the bodily service. In other words, is a slave only is the only virtue the slave the only virtue of a slave is his instrumental value, his instrumental doing his job well, doing the function that he's doing well, or is there something that in the condition, I mean, not the condition or function, yeah, the state that this is there something higher here? That's one question, right? Question, in other words, is it only bodily service, the bodily service that or is there something higher? That's one question. Questions arise either way, for if there is such a virtue of a slave, right? How will they differ from a free person? So, in other words, the question then becomes: If there are if there is virtues like courage, these kind of virtues um, of a slave, then how do they differ from a free person, right? So that's the sub part of it. But if there is not, though they are human beings and share in reason, it is odd. In other words, there is not a difference between them in that sense. And though they're human beings and share in reason, it is odd. Now that's the question: do they share in reason? Do slaves share in reason? Because the argument is they share in reason, but they don't possess it, right? They defective in it. The argument was the natural slave, But he doesn't talk about the natural slave here. He talks about the slave in general, right? So therefore, this is that first problem, the problem of slavery. Is there a virtue in this, and how, and this leads to the question of what's the difference between a free person and the unfree. In other words, what defines the free and the unfree, right? Um, but if there is not a difference in this, right, though they are human beings and share in reason, it is odd, right? Nearly the same question arises concerning women and child, whether there are virtues belonging to these as well, whether the woman should be moderate and courageous and just, and whether a child is capable of being licentious and moderate or not, right? So therefore, the questions of the characters of children and women, are they able to? Now here he says, and in general, then this must be investigated concerning the ruled by nature and the ruler by nature. Whether virtue is the same or different. So therefore, this is a big question. Is virtue the same for all, or does the ruled by nature have virtue unique to them, and the ruled by nature has unique to them, right? For if both should partake in gentlemanliness, and by here he means the kalos agathos, if I'm correct, this is what 59. Gentlemanliness is kalos agathia, which is the primary, which means a splendid virtue of the noble and good man. As Newman notes, the question is put as paradoxically as possible, for the kalogathia is precisely the type of virtue from which slaves, women, and children are furthest removed, and that's from Nicomachean Ethics, for book 4, chapter 7. For if you both partake, gentlemen, okay. For if both who partake in the kalos agatheos, the good and the beautiful and good man, the good and noble, the good and beautiful man, why should the one rule and the other ruled once and for all? In other words, if both should partake in this virtue, why should one rule and the other be ruled once and for all? Okay. So therefore, in other words, if they're all capable of achieving this concept, and that's again says paradoxically because the answer is that he in his ethics he argues that this virtue is unique, and that it's that slaves and women and children are not capable of doing this, right? Um, for it for it is not possible for them to differ by greater or lesser, since being ruled and ruling differ in kind, not by greater and lesser. So in other words, greater and lesser implies that there's a consistency, like there's more or less, right? More or less of the same thing. But ruling, it's in other words, it's just more. It is everything of us coming. It's levels of activity of the same kind of action, right? It's on the same dimension. Whereas the argument here is ruler and ruled, naturally ruled and naturally ruling, are different in kind. Even though that together they need each other in that sense, but the ruling and ruled are two different things. They differ in kind in that sense, not in degree, right? And again, that echoes what he said in all the way in chapter 1 about the difference between a politicos, a despotikos, a economikos, and a um, um, basileus, king, political ruler, a kingly ruler, head of household, and then household manager and master of slaves. But that he goes is greater and less, but that one should have virtue and the other not would be surprising. So that if they're not different, right, and that one should have virtue, but that one should have virtue and the other not would be surprising. So that's a very interesting thing. So if it's not possible to put them, if it's not possible for them to differ by greater and lesser, since the ruler and ruled is different kind, but not by greater and less, um, um, not by greater and lesser, but one should have such virtue and the other would not be surprising. For unless the ruler is moderate and just, how will he rule beautifully, finally? Okay, right? Rulers need this. And unless the ruled is, how will, in other words, if the ruled is not also moderate and just, how will he be ruled finally? In other words, okay, so therefore there's an irony that that virtue seems to be universal towards our human being, not to the condition of being ruler and ruled. At one sense. In other words, this is saying that virtue seems to be tied to human beings, but there is some differences of virtue. Virtue that fundamentally virtue there might be a commonality where virtue is interconnected with all human beings who have reason, but then they might differ also to some degree in some application of it, right? Um, for if he is licentious and cowardly, he would perform none of his duties. So therefore, that's the danger, right? Unless he, so therefore, that's the danger of even the ruler, the ruled needs to be moderate and just, right? If he's licentious and cowardly, he will not perform some of his duties. It is evident then that both must of necessity partake in virtue, excellence, but that there are differences in their virtue as there are in the virtue of those who are by nature ruled. So therefore, in other words, it's not the question of there's different virtues. All partake in virtue, but what differs is what is what I think he's trying to say here that they must partake in virtue, but the difference is in their virtue, but that there are differences in their virtue, right? As there are in the virtues of those who are ruled by nature. Consideration of the soul guides us straight away to this conclusion. In other words, again, the soul, the idea that the mastery, again the psyche, the soul means here not it's tied, it's the animus desire. It's that part of the thing that animates our this is where reason is, our ability to foresight think. That's why the word psyche, soul is psyche. It's that part of us that is able to discern, reason about things, to judge, to make deliberations. It is also the desiring element that desires, and it is the desiring element that kind of links us to our bodies in that sense. So therefore, this is how the soul interacts to the body, right? Remember, you talked about the soul and the body rule. And in fact, the soul rules the body despotically, in that sense. He said earlier. Um, uh, in other words, considerations of the soul guide us straight away to this conclusion, right? This idea that there's a difference between souls. That certain soul, the soul of a free person is going to be different than the soul of an unfree. The naturally ruled will have a different soul than the naturally ruling, right? This is unless there is no. If all souls are the same, if all souls are identical, then there's no naturally ruled and naturally ruling, right? But since he says that there are naturally ruled and ruling, therefore there must be a difference in that their souls in that sense. Um, for in this, there is by nature a ruling and ruled element, and we assert that there is a different virtue of each. That is, for the element having reason and the irrational element. In other words, Okay, so therefore, even though there's this, in other words, that there is a difference between the natural rule and natural law, we assert that there is a different virtue of each, and that of the element having reason, and in other words, that element is having reason and of the irrational element. So it's that the idea of the rational and the irrational, right? That the ruling one has a stronger aspect of the rational and less irrational, whereas the ruled is more irrational and less rational. Okay, uh, it is clear then that the same thing holds for the other cases, children and women as well. Right. This is thus by nature most things are ruling and ruled. So therefore, the question of in nature there's a kind of ruling and rule. There's domination. We can say there's one who has authority over the other, right? There's a one who has authority and status, and they rule over the other, right? That in nature there is this kind of idea here in that sense. That's by nature most things are ruling and ruled. But this is interesting. The most by let's these carefully sentence. Thus, by nature, most things are ruling and ruled. This could be read as saying that in nature most things are both ruling and ruled in that sense, or are some are ruled and some are ruling. Okay, it's a very awkward sentence here for that purpose. For the free person rules the slave, the male the female, and the man the adult the child, in different ways. Okay, so therefore they're not the same. The relationship he's saying that they're not the relationship between free and slave, master, female, in different ways. The parts of the soul are present at all, but they are present in different ways. The slave is wholly lacking in the deliberative element. Okay, so they're wholly lacking of the deliberative element. I think this is the natural slave in that sense. Is I think this is the slave here is I think referring to the natural slave, not the conventional slave. The female has it, but it lacks authority. Now, this is that weird line. It is not, or is not sovereign, a creon. In other words, it's lacking authority. I think I don't like lacking authority. It's not ruling. Creon, creos, creon. A is alpha privative. Creos, creon. Creon is the rule, to be ruled, to rule it. It's some have taken this simply to referring to the woman's subordination to her husband, but it seems most likely that Aristotle is suggesting that the deliberative element of women is weaker relative to their own passions. This is the famous typical critique of this. But I think this is more about the question of by it's not ruling. In other words, it 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 has something to do that women do not have the same desire to rule, don't have the same desire, a need for rule in that sense, or they it's something is missing in them in that sense. This to that the child has it, but it is incomplete. So therefore the slave lacks it completely. The women have it, but it lacks the ruling element is not as ruling. Okay, and that the child has it, but it's incomplete. It is supposed to. It is to be supposed that the same necessary holds concerning the virtues of character. All must share in them, but not in the same way, but to each in relation to their own function. Hence, the ruler must have complete virtue of character, for his function is in is in the absolute sense that of a master craftsman, and reason is a master craftsman. Um, while each of the others must have as much as falls to him individually. So the virtue must be, in other words, this is interesting. He says, um, the virtues of character has to be the question of this, right? All sharing them, but not in the same way. So everyone has virtue and character, but they're going to differ in their in relationship, who they are, what they are, They're going to have them. They have access to them, but they're not going to be operational in them in the same way, right? And he says all must share in them, but not in the same way, but in relation to their own function, right? And hence the ruler must have complete virtue of character. This is interesting because why? Because he's the master craftsman and he's going to be crafting the other ones. So that's the idea that but again, I think this is a discussion about the master, the slave, the master by nature, the ruler by nature. The ruler by nature must possess all the virtues. In that sense, right? It is thus evident that there is a virtue of character that belongs to all of these mentions, and that the moderation of a woman and a man is not the same, nor their courage or justice, as Socrates supposed, but that there is a ruling and serving courage, and similarly with the other virtues. In other words, there's a and he seems to be saying that there are courage, virtue, all these things, but they're going to differ between these types of this. And he says that therefore, in regards to man and woman, that the courage of a man and the courage of a woman are not going to be identical. There's going to be this is gender differences, right? I mean, Aristotle's pointing out to the reality of gender differences. That the difference that there was a spectrum of what is possible, and we know this in statistics. When you look at capacities, right? We look at the way women tend to have higher means. In other words, if you look at a distribution curve, if the median point is higher in one, that means the tails will pop in, right? And if the median is lower, then the distribution will tail out like this. So that therefore, this is with we know this in IQ that women the median point of women tend to have much higher. There tends to be more at the mean of women at the median level of IQ are more. There's more women at the median than men at the median, right? Relative to each group. Then the problem then has the distribution of each group, because the higher curve will pull the tails in. Therefore, what will happen is that the extreme ends, both higher and lower extreme ends of intelligence, there'll be more men than women. That's just this nature of a distribution curve. That's how it works. So if there's, in other words, if the median point there's more women than men, right? At the median point, this means the distribution will pull in. In other words, the women will pull in the distribution of the curve, particularly if they're a relatively equal number. If they're slightly more, then it might still push out some more. But the ray is that if given how significantly high it is, then the distribution will differ in that sense, right? Classic argument. And therefore, this is what Aristotle's kind of pointing to here, that the difference is not going to be against. He's echoing what Socrates said about this, right, in the Republic and elsewhere. It is clear further, if we investigate the matter in more detail, for those who say in a general way that virtue is a good, or excellence, or aite, is a good condition of the soul, or acting correctly, or something of this sort, deceive themselves. Woo. In other words, that those who say that virtue is a good or condition of the soul, or acting correctly, or something like this, deceive themselves. Those who emulate the virtues, like Gorgias, do much better than those who define it this way. Now, this is a very interesting 61 here. This is again reference to Plato's Meno. And this is a critique of Plato, and arguing that Gorgias seems to be brighter. That Gorgias is actually more right here than one should thus consider that the matter stands with everyone, as the poet said of women, to a woman's silence as an ornament. Okay, right? Again, this is 62. This is Sophocles' Ajax. But then again, we have to be careful. That's a very odd claim. Because if we read that Ajax poem, that's a very interesting. That's about the women. The women's silence leads Ajax to do a great. A woman is telling Ajax, "Hey, you're being," tells him the truth, about it, and Ajax is about to fool himself and humiliate himself, and that leads to his death, right? And that the response is that the women should be silent is pointing is not. I mean, so therefore, what the context of the reference to the poem suggests something different. That one should consider that the matter stands with everyone, as the poet said of the woman, right? Though though this is not the case for a man. So the word silence is like an ornament. And remember, it's an ornament. An ornament is not a characteristic. It's something that looks. Ornament is something that looks well. But again, that's that case here of the. Pay attention to this that 60 the example of Ajax in that situation. The suggestion is the woman was right. And if Ajax listened to the woman, his the tragedy would not have happened the way it does. But silencing her or ignoring her was led to the tragedy. Okay, that's the so. But though it's not the case for a man, right? The man is that again. This is the perception that we'd if okay, I'm back. I'm sorry, I was interrupted by a series of things. So let's continue here. That we talked about the question of the virtue of a person, right? The virtue of something. And he said that we ended up with the question here is that the women of silence of that. We talked about the thing about this. Since the child is incomplete, it is clear that the virtue is too is not. In other words, since the child is incomplete, it is clear that its virtue too is not its own as relating to itself, but as relating to its end in the person leading it. So therefore, the virtue of a child is really that the what as he's leading to his adulthood, right? That he becomes a person, right? So therefore, that's the whole question here: is that child is incomplete, and because it's incomplete, its virtue too is not its own as relating to itself, but rather relating to its end, that is being a complete adult, right? And the person leading it, in other words, who's leading it to that end. The same is true that of the slave in relation to the master. So therefore, in other words, the virtue of the slave is tied like the women. It's kind of like they have virtue, but it's not ruling in that sense, or it's not. It's in other words that women, the virtue there is exists, but there's that weird question about being silent, right? The child is incomplete virtue. The slave, however, and therefore it's towards its end now, towards the virtue of the slave in relation to its master, right? We laid it down that the slave is useful with respect to the necessary things, so that he clearly needs only a small amount of virtue, as much as will prevent him from falling short of his work through licentience and cowardice. So therefore, this is the idea: is that it's instrumental. His virtue, in other words, the only virtue he needs is that virtue which allows him to be useful as the instrument. So therefore, so that he should not be licentious, should not be cowardly, but brave slave. That's very interesting. One might raise the objection, raise the question whether, if what has just been said is true, artisans too will need virtue, since they often fall short in their work through licentious, right? Artisans, craftsmen. And he says that that's true about the slave. Is that also true about the artisan, right? And he goes, yeah. Or is the case very different? For the slave is a sharer in the master's life, while the other is more remote and has virtue only so far as he is also a slave. So, therefore, in other words, this idea is that you know, the craftsman is he's a slave. He's a slave. He's part. A slave shares the life of the master, and therefore there is a concern about the character of the people who you live with. Whereas the concern, if this worker's far away and you don't live with them, you don't share a life with them, do you really care about them that much to that same degree? Do you really want their, in other words, the question of their courage and their licentience has to do with you sharing a life together, it seems to me, that he said, Aristotle was saying here. For the slave is a sharer in the master's life, while the other is more remote and has virtue only or excellence only so far as he is also a slave, right? So therefore, that if the merchant is therefore tied there, for the manufacturing artisan is under a special sort of slavery, while the slave belongs among those persons or things that are by nature, no shoemaker does, nor any of the other artisans. So the artisans are like a slave in that they working for others. They don't work for themselves, but they are what but they're not slaves in the sense that they're not, in other words they while a slave belongs to a person, the artist does not. The artist serves a person. In other words, their servitude, their service, their labor is is being controlled or being uh, uh, there's a master or someone paying for it, and they're working for that person. So there is a subordination of authority and control, but there is not you don't belong to them, whereas the slave belongs to the master, right? Um, so therefore, a slave belongs to those persons, among those persons or things that are by nature in that sense. A slave is something by nature, where shoemakers and these things are not by nature. It is evident, therefore, that the master should be responsible for instilling this sort of virtue in the slave. In other words, he is not merely someone possessing an art of mastery that instructs the slave in his work. So therefore, it's not, in other words, he has to make them somewhat decent to live with. This is interesting. The slave, there is a obligation of the master to the slave. That is that he is not licentious, and it's not negative. As he has to have courage in order to do his job, and he needs to be not licentious in that sense, right? That therefore the master should be responsible for instilling this sort of virtue that you know, not merely someone possessing a art of mastery that instructs the slave. In other words, the art of mastery is not merely the instructing of slaves. And this is what here he contradicts and alters the art of mastery. The art of mastery earlier was simply just a mastery is not it's a low thing, which only deals with helping a slave knowing what the slave needs to do and how to do it. Now it's also kind of an education. He's required to lease the slave the minimal amount of virtue that a slave needs. He needs to ensure that they get it, right? Those who deny reason to slaves and asserts that command only should be used with them do not argue beautifully. And admonition is to be used with slaves more than with children. In other words, it's in other words, shouldn't say don't, admonition. Say don't do that. Don't. It's like yelling at them, right? You should not do that to children. He's saying that children. But concerning these matters, let our discussion stand thus. He's going to end the discussion here. Concerning husband and wife, uh, children and father, and the sort of virtue excellence that is connected with each of these, and what is and what is not fine or beautiful, kalos, in their relations with one another, and how one should pursue what is well and avoid the bad. These things must necessarily be addressed in the discourses of regime on the regimes. Now, there is no discussion of the story. In other words, what is meant by this, right? Reference seems to be to book 2 to 8 or 3 to 8, right? So the discussion of the regimes, right? He doesn't talk about these things, but therefore the question is, it's still something that needs to be in a discourse or thinking about the regime. These things, these questions, need to understand uh, that the concerning the wife, the father, child, what sort of virtue is connected to each of these, and what is that virtue, what is and what is not fine in their relation to one another. These questions here, the sentence, are tied to those who are concerned with the regime needs to concern themselves with it. Now, he did not do this. This is interesting. This is telling in that sense. But it isn't telling. Is it that is this simply to be dismissed, or is this really kind of there but we don't see it? Okay, that's an interesting question. I would argue it's there. It's argued it's in the multitude. To understand the multitude and the multitude parts are going to understand these questions. Okay, since the household as a whole is part of the city, and these things of the household uh, uh, and these things of the household, and one should look at the virtue of the part in relation to the virtue of the whole. Both children and women must necessarily be educated looking towards the regime. At least it makes at least if it makes any difference with the view to the city being excellent, that both its children and its women are excellent. So therefore he's saying that there's going to be a question. And in other words, if you're concerned about virtue, it's the virtue that's tied to this educated. In other words, that women and children must necessarily be educated looking toward the regime. So virtue is not an absolute virtue. It's a virtue relative to the particular regime type. So every regime is going to have a different set of virtue. It's going to, and actually, we'll see this when he talks about the regime, the politeia. The politeia will be the virtue. What the virtue is each politeia will stress different virtues. Will make different claims about what is virtue, what is just, and things like this. So therefore, that is an interesting thing. That's so. Therefore, the question. This question is going to be, in other words, this is the discussion of the household and the discussion of the virtues of the parts. The household is not defined by itself alone. It's a chicken egg thing. It's the relationship between the household and the city is always going to be mediated again by the regime, he seems to suggest here. This is why the discussion of looking at the parts, starting looking at the parts to see the whole, is going to be insufficient. Because it is not merely the parts. In other words, there's something mediating that works both ways. That 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 shapes the character and the relations of the parts of the virtues, and also is therefore that, that mediates the polis. In other words, so therefore we haven't discovered what is the secret part of the most important element about what really defines the city. Okay, yes, the city is composed of households. It's a constructed element of households, but that in itself is points to a bigger question: the question of how does the part relate to the whole? And we can only know that after we discover the regime, which he mentions here. Okay, again, this discourse on regimes that therefore we have to. It should have been talked about, so that's very interesting. But now he talks about it here in that sense, right? The need to take concern the virtue of the regime, right? Um, but it is necessary. But it necessarily makes a difference. Women are a part amounting to a half of free persons, and the children. In other words, women are half of a free person. In other words, a husband and wife together, a half of a free person. And from the children come those who are sharers in the regime. So, in other words, that this is interesting. The two become one, right? Husband and wife become one. He's silent about that, but he says the wife is half of a free person. And from the children comes those who are sharers in the regime. So, since there is been discussions of these matters, and we must speak elsewhere of those remaining, let us leave off the present discourse as having reached an end, a telos, a kind of conclusion, and make another beginning to this argument. In other words, we've come to an end of the thing, and it's kind of an unsatisfactory end. We can't get to where we want to go here. He seems to be saying. So now he says, let us investigate in the first instant the views that have been put forward about the best regime. So now he's going to suggest another way. Let's look at since studying the city is the household is a part of a city. The city is aggregations of households. trying to understand the city in light of its parts and what the city does. The activity of the city is the politics. So therefore, to understand that in light of what the activity of the household is, doesn't get us anywhere. It's a failed end. It's a kind of like a false lead. We went through this and it's false lead. Now, this doesn't mean that nothing here is what he says here is going to be readdressed or reused and does not have truth in it. No, it does have truth in it, but it is only that it's come to a false end. And he says that let us investigate in the first instant the views that have been put forward of the best, and therefore this is what he's going to say we're going to do in the next book. Okay, so there ends book one of the politics, chapter 13, book one of the politics. If you have any, sorry, there's interruptions, and I could have maybe read back in time a little bit. If you like what like, okay, if you have any comments, put them below. I see them. I will respond to them. If you like what you said here, like. If you don't like, and say why. Share with a friend, forward it in the social media. If you want to keep on getting the automatic notifications, please subscribe. Let's encourage other people who are interested in these things to subscribe. It will build up the channel a little bit. If you wish to be a patron and help, with the continuation of this and helping me do this more, maybe even to become better at it, please be a Patreon through Patreon or subscribe star. I don't care. I have only one subscribe star member. It's not much. Or if you want to help contribute to the channel, you can always buy my Lulu book, which is about politics. It's not about it's a notebook on Aristotle's politics, a workbook, and it's designed as a kind of a study guide, a cliff notes on the politics, not as mere summaries that could be read as in lieu of reading the book, but it is a workbook and study guide. Now that's a page here for the notes. After every book, I have a blank page that you can have the notes there. There's charts and there's activities. This is the breakdown. That's okay. We just finished chapter 1. Let's go look at chapter 2 here. This is what we're going to be doing chapter 2, right? This is the logic and breakdown of the chapters, and then I explain these and this, that in this book. So it's under $30. Yes, it's not cheap. I wanted it to be lesser. It's better. Publishing it myself was better than the publishers wanted to do it. The publishers that wanted to do this, two book publishers wanted it, and they wanted to charge $150 as a student book, student tool. And I kind of no. That's how textbooks go these days, $100 to $150. And I said, no. And doing it myself through Lulu, I was hoping to get it under 20, but just to get a couple dollars, I needed it to be around, and for the cost of printing, about under 30. I want it under 20, but today's inflation rate, about under 20. So that's that. I'll stop here, and I hope you all have a good day. I think we're over. This is a chapter. I'll see you our next time as we start book 2 of the politics.